if I'm really me. Yeah.
Okay, if everybody could get back in their seats, that would be great. This next panel should be excellent. Moderating is Professor Chris Sands from Johns Hopkins, and I'll turn it over to him.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. I am honored to be on a panel of such distinguished legal experts in the area of international trade. And the first introduction I have to make is to our Henry King awardee this year, Dick Cunningham, who couldn't be here, who is the rightful chair of this panel. Really the ghost in the room, because he's organized several calls and pulled us all together to talk about the themes, and you'll see his fingerprints sometimes on the coherence and I think the quality of the panelists today. We have three terrific panelists for you. To my right is Terry Stewart, who's a managing partner at Stewart & Stewart in Washington, D.C. He has a Harvard MBA and his law degree from Georgetown. His practice is focused on trade remedy, and he is a legend in the D.C. trade community, having worked both officially and unofficially sort of with the U.S. government and its various trade bodies, as well as in private practice as one of our leading trade litigators. To his right is Ambassador John Weeks, well known to the Cusley community. He's a senior business advisor at Bennett Jones, a former Canadian ambassador to the World Trade Organization, a proud graduate of the University of Toronto. He was Canada's chief Nafta negotiator and has been a senior associate deputy minister for foreign affairs, long experience with the GATT, then the WTO, and now serves as occasional panelist on WTO dispute panels as well. To his right is Ambassador Alan Wolf, who's senior counsel at Dentons. He's a proud graduate of Harvard and has his law degree from Columbia. He's a former deputy U.S. Trade Representative and General Counsel at USTR from the days before it was USTR and it was just the Office of the Special Trade Representative, and served as a lawyer at the U.S. Department of Treasury. He is also, we heard earlier about Governor Blanchard being a super lawyer. He is also a super lawyer, giving him extra powers, I suppose, in these things. And has, despite a long and very distinguished career, a particularly important and relevant role now, having been a key advisor to stakeholders during the negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, yet to be concluded. So, three panelists who bring us a tremendous breadth of experience from both sides of our border. I'm going to start with Terry, and we'll continue from there.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to be on the panel with John and Alan, who will carry the heavy lifting. What my job was to try to explain how the Trump administration trade policy, such as it is, has come to be. I prepared a paper which is available to you that kind of walks through my effort to decipher that. And I think the easy starting point is a slide that I put up, which tracks the U.S. trade deficit in goods compared to the timing of various trade agreements that have the United States has entered into. And what you see is, if you go back to the late 1969, when we had a trade surplus, that we have been on a downward spiral, if you will, and major events would have included NAFTA, would have included the Uruguay round, and would have included China's accession to the WTO as probably the three major points. Now, one could say, who cares? But the fact that we have gone from a trade surplus to $750 billion annual trade deficit in goods has been an issue of great concern to some in the country, and including many working class folks in Midwestern states, in states that were pivotal in the last election. When you couple that with the fact that if you take a look at non-farm income in the United States on a per capita for a family basis, over the last 43 years, there has been a decline in real dollars of more than 10%. You had a building storm of discontent And neither political party, Democrat or Republican, were really postured to understand or grasp that. Because and trade has been one of those interesting areas where the trade policy folks inside the Beltway for both parties have been fairly closely aligned with relatively small differences. And so if you look at the last election, you had two outsiders. You had Bernie Sanders on the left and you had Donald Trump on the right, who raised this issue about the trade inequities in the system, and that resonated with a lot of people. So statistically, you can see where the issue is. U.S. government historically has always talked about how many jobs are created by exports, and they have refused to identify that any jobs have ever been lost to imports. And so for people who like to believe that the people inside the Beltway are disconnected to the problems that face average Americans, stagnant incomes, in fact, declining incomes in real terms, and a very large and globally unheard of trade deficit over the years, would create the kind of environment in which somebody who promised to deal with that problem would receive support. And I would say that the election was a tipping point in terms of making that a central issue. Lots of discussion as to why that's not a valid concern. But for this administration, it is a very important issue. And when you take that down to the individual countries where we have large deficits, obviously, China is at the top of that list, but other important trading partners where we have big deficits include Mexico, Japan, Korea, and Germany. And if you take those countries alone, you account for the vast majority of the trade deficit. And hence, if you look at the language that has come out from the administration, the early morning tweets and other identifications of countries who are where we have quote unquote bad deals, these are the countries who have been identified, and it is directly tied to the large trade deficit that we have with those countries. If you further, building on what the earlier panel this morning had to say, if you take a look at auto and auto parts, or motor vehicles and parts for motor vehicles, what you find is that it is the largest part of our trade deficit globally, and for these 5 countries, it is the majority, and in the case of Mexico, more than 100% of the trade deficit. So if you're trying to figure out where the administration is going and what they're focused on issues that were of concern in the states that resulted in the president getting elected. The swing states in the Midwest and in the East, where manufacturing is important. And in fact, it wasn't until the trade policy, 2017 presidential trade policy came out, that you saw anything coming out from the administration that went beyond manufactured goods and picked up small item of agriculture or the relatively minor part of every economy known as services. So that has been where the focus has been, and what that has meant is that the government's focus is on how you make those deficits disappear. The negotiations that will go on, at least from the administration's point of view, are intended to try to address that. There have been meetings with industry groups. Autos was one of the early ones that they had, and it is an effort to try to identify what do you need changed in the economy so that you will, in fact, be more like Germany and less like the United States in terms of the large deficit that we run in autos and auto parts, since it drives a lot of manufacturing jobs all around the world and certainly in the United States. So you have those things. If you look at the trade policy, there were 4 priorities that the administration identified, the first of which was maintaining sovereignty over domestic trade policy. This is really a reflection of the challenges that the United States and other countries, in fact, have faced in the WTO, but the United States has faced particularly in the WTO, and in particular in the trade remedy arena, where 60% of the cases that have been brought in the WTO have been against the United States, who has brought a total of 12 to 13% of the trade remedy cases, despite the fact we were a major negotiator in the Uruguay round, and despite the fact that the agreements on dumping and countervailing duties largely reflected existing U.S. law. All right, so the fact that there is concern in the United States and has been in the Congress for the last 15 years that the appellate body is in some ways uncheckable, which is largely the fault of how we created the system, is a top priority and a major concern. The second concern priority being enforcement, strong enforcement of trade laws. You can't really have one without the other, but you are seeing executive orders come out that are trying to address some of the problems that industries who have had trade problems face. There was an announcement of one coming out today that will deal with a problem that has grown exponentially as trade with China has grown, namely evasion of dumping duties and countervailing duties, a relatively minor issue in global trade, but an important issue for industries who have trade remedies in place and are not getting effective remedies. The Customs Service has, GAO put out a report, I think last year, that identified that something like $2.7 billion in duties had not been collected over a 10-year time period in terms of orders. This is a matter that's been of great concern to the industries who are affected. While the administration's trade policy may be transactional in nature, an effort to try to deal with trade deficits, obviously trade policy and negotiations is not limited, is not controlled by the executive branch itself, but rather is a joint effort with the Congress, and you can see that in terms of what the administration's draft notice of what they would like to deal with in the NAFTA renegotiations includes. It includes a whole host of issues that members of the Senate Finance Committee, House Ways and Means Committee have as concerns that are part of the Trade Promotion Authority that is out there. So I have very little doubt that when we finally get to the notification of intent to enter negotiations with Canada and Mexico, that it will be a broad-based effort. That broad base will not be a confrontational list, in my view. It will be an effort to expand upon what has been done to deal with new areas such as have been picked up in the TPP. One of the interesting challenges is how much of TPP will be picked up and included from the United States point of view, and how much of it will be tweaked to address particular problems that various members of the Senate Finance Committee in particular had with the TPP agreement that was there. Certainly the issues will be more complex as it relates to our friends in Mexico than it will be with our northern neighbors. So I think with that I will stop and turn it over to John.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. That's a good beginning, a good outline, I think, of the situation. Let me start by saying that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Canadian government. I know that's obvious, but I just want to say that because I occasionally slip into using we as if I still was a government official. But I'm only speaking with the full authority of the rank of citizen. Let me start with a few comments because you've set the stage rather broadly in terms of the United States. Let me start a little bit with Canada and what I'll call the Canadian trade negotiations agenda. Now, obviously, the biggest thing on the horizon for us is the renegotiation of Nafta. But there are a lot of other things that we're looking at. So let me run through that. First of all, let me start with the cabinet because it's quite interesting. you may recall Chrystia Freeland was our international trade minister, and she then became foreign minister. And what I don't think is known by everybody is that she took with her to the foreign ministry, which is all housed in the same department called Global Affairs Canada as the trade ministry, the responsibility for Canada-United States trade relations and for Nafta. So you have Chrystia Freeland with that file, so the big file. And then you have François-Philippe Champagne, who's been made the Minister for International Trade. And I hadn't realized until the Dean spoke last night that he studied here at Case, studied law. So there's a connection there with our conference. He's a very active. He's had a lot of very good business experience. He was a vice president of Asia Brown Boveri, for instance. He's had a number of different positions that give him a good perspective on international commerce. He's ambitious and he's vigorous. And he's got lots of ideas, and I think his deputy minister has trouble keeping up with him. But what I'm saying here is we've got, at the top, we've got a minister who's focused on Canada-US matters, and another minister who's sort of free, as it were, to deal with other parts of the world. So what else is going on? Reference has already been made to the fact that our agreement with the European Union, it will come into force provisionally probably before summer, the start of the summer. We're now, of course, looking at, what do we do with the United Kingdom? The United Kingdom is our largest market in the European Union. And clearly there's already, well, we're not having negotiations, but there are discussions going on about what do we do when we get to the point of wanting to have an agreement with the UK that would at least maintain and hopefully actually improve on what is in CETA. Because, of course, when CETA comes in, our agreement with the European Union, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, when it comes into force, the UK will still be part of the European Union, so the agreement will apply to the UK until such time as the UK leaves. So people need to plan for that. We have a free trade agreement with Korea, which has come into force relatively recently. As was mentioned, we've initiated exploratory discussions with China to look towards establishing a free trade agreement. I suspect that's a process that will take some time, but it's now been initiated. We very much like to have a free trade agreement with Japan. For us, as I think in many respects for the United States as well, the main prize in terms of what would be new in the Trans-Pacific Partnership was going to be an agreement with Japan. And we're already feeling the pressure because Australia has a free trade agreement with Japan and a lot of their goods are going in on a preferential basis. So we'd like to do that. And we're quite alarmed when we hear that the United States might do a bilateral agreement with Japan, because that would make this situation we face it's very unfair of discriminatory trade barriers. And so we're worried about that, and that how to manage that and how to protect and advance our relations with Japan is an important point. They're a very large trading partner. We have free trade negotiations going on with India, obviously a significant country, but those negotiations are in some difficulty because there seem to be a number of issues which come up which are difficult to resolve. We're looking at the possibility of having a negotiation with Mercosur. This is a sort of recurring theme, and it sort of depends on the political constellation in that part of the world, how we look at it. We're looking at what can we do in Asia now that TPP isn't going anywhere for the moment, beyond Japan and China. And so, the idea is being talked about of looking at initiating a free trade negotiation with the ASEAN countries. And also some thought being given to the free trade nation of the Pacific, which of course is an APEC initiative, which may not be for tomorrow given the position of the United States government, but is interesting because of course it would actually involve the United States and China as well as most of these other countries in the region. So I come back to, so there's a lot going on. And the point was made that, we realize that as we've realized for some time in Canada, that maybe we need to look at taking steps to diversify our trade relationships. And I would say we're trying to do that. It's not going to lead to any miraculous change in terms of where the most important trade relationships are. I think forever, I suspect, the United States will be our principal trading partner. Now, obviously, the election of Mr. Trump and proposals to renegotiate NAFTA have captured a lot of attention in Canada. And but I think it's important to recognize that while we've now seen a draft letter that the president intends to send to Congress about his intention to initiate a renegotiation of NAFTA, we don't know what the final form of that letter would be. And of course, that's only a letter still to Congress. It's not a letter to us. It gives some signals about what we maybe need to be getting ready for. But what we really need to wait for in terms of, I think, sort of as a government reacting publicly, is what proposals are actually brought to the negotiating table. And I guess we're still at least 3 months away from that, because the formal letter signals a 90-day period, which is a minimum, not a maximum. And so what are we doing? What's going on? Well, as you heard, we now have a chief negotiator for the NAFTA. There are consultations going on. I think it's pretty clear that they know who they need to consult with most seriously now, because you can make some judgments about what some of the focus of this negotiation will be about. So that can be underway. Developing Canadian ideas and proposals. So we're in a state of active preparation, but also sort of a waiting game. By the way, maybe at this point I'll say something. If we're looking at a situation in which, how long this process of renegotiation is going to take is a little unclear. Wilbur Ross has said publicly he thinks the United States wouldn't be ready to sit down and have detailed negotiations until late this year. And then he hoped, this was a couple of weeks ago, maybe this has changed by now, I don't know, hoped that it would be possible to conclude those negotiations within about a year from that date. So we're right in the middle of the midterm elections is where we are. And we're past the Mexican election, and we're a year away from the next Canadian federal election. I'm not sure that this is ideal timing for trying to reach an agreement, but anyway, there could be some problems there. By that time, in fact, depending on how this plays out I've been in a number of panels lately that involve the Mexicans as well, including one in Minnesota earlier this week with Jaime Serra and Carla Hills. And one of the things that comes up in these discussions, just to put Mexico in the picture for a minute, is that we have the polling in Mexico at the moment shows that if the Mexican presidential elections that are scheduled for, I think, June of next year were held today, that Obrador, the former communist mayor of Mexico City and a virulent anti-American, would win, and no doubt Mexico, under that scenario, might withdraw from the North American Free Trade Agreement. But in any event, it would usher in, I suspect there's a lot of prospect here that I would say from the point of view of United States-Mexican relations, that the lesser problem might turn out to be NAFTA and trade, and the bigger problem will be border security and a total lack of cooperation on migration from Central America and drug controls and other things. So I just put that out there because there are a lot of uncertainties as to how this is going to unfold. Let me say something now about the Canadian perception of this, because and let me go back, because we've heard a lot about American perceptions Mr. Trump clearly thinks this is all unfair and unbalanced and so on. So Canadian perceptions. When we started negotiating the free trade agreement with the United States, there were very serious concerns in Canada, a large segment of the population, that this was really a pretty crazy idea. That here we were sitting down to negotiate a free trade agreement with a country that was much larger and much more powerful. And a lot of Canadians were convinced that we were going to lose our shirt and perhaps worse. And indeed, when we concluded that agreement, the Canadian election of 1988 was fought essentially on the one issue of the free trade agreement. And there was a point in that election where the polling showed that the government was going to lose the election. Well, in the end, they didn't, but it was a very close run thing. And then in the Nafta, when we were negotiating the Nafta, a lot of the same concerns came back. We're going to, what are we doing? We're exposed again. And there, I think it was something like 75% of Canadians thought it was a bad idea for us to be negotiating the Nafta. The polling has now changed around considerably because Canadians have realized, well, the bad things that people said were going to happen didn't happen. And actually, while we have a balanced trade relationship with the United States, it's one in which Canadians are doing well. It's had a beneficial effect, and Canadians acknowledge that pretty broadly. However, we get into, and I was struck, let me come back to what Jim Blanchard said earlier when he was talking about people he talked to about the sort of relief that Mike Pence as vice president. And I don't want to quote too selectively, but you mentioned that two of the things that he's in favor of were the rule of law and the Constitution. If anybody had told me when we finished negotiating the NAFTA that 20 years later or 25 years later, I'd be sitting at a conference and people would be saying that it's a good thing that the Vice President of the United States believes in the rule of law and the Constitution, I would have thought, this is an impossible scenario to imagine. So, but yes, we believe in Canada, we believe in the rule of law. We think it's important, and we like it domestically, and we also like it internationally, because when we negotiate an agreement, we want to know where we stand. We don't want a deal that we say, okay, where we have to renegotiate it every 4 or 5 years because it's starting to look unbalanced from the other side. We don't want to create rules that are changed every time the United States is doing better than or doing worse than we are. And let me here too say, because there's a lot of discussion about trade balances, and you can argue whether they're really relevant or not to consideration of trade policy. But let me just point out that if you look at the Canadian trade balance with the United States, we do run traditionally, but not every year, a trade surplus in goods. But if you take out raw materials and energy products in particular, then the United States has a very large surplus in manufactured goods with Canada. Manufactured goods. They also have a very large surplus in services. So, I think when Canadian, so the government is going to have difficulty potentially, depending on the kind of negotiation we get into, managing a situation in which Canadians see that we're really under fire and attack. And I think the government will negotiate in good faith and be prepared to do a number of things. There are constructive things we can do in terms of borrowing things from the PPP. But when we get down to some of those hardcore issues that are obvious, you can find them in the national trade estimates. They're there every year. They're now in the letter. And I think that there'll be some issues on which the Canadian government will probably say, no, we're not going to do that. We've done this, this, and this, and this. And we've asked you to do this and this and this, and you've said you'll do that, but you've said no, 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 no to all these other things. We'll want to negotiate in a way that makes it clear that we've engaged in a good faith effort to produce something. But there could well be a point at which we'll say enough is enough. That's it. you have to go away and decide, draw your own conclusions about what you're going to do as a result of that situation. And so, I put that out there. Let me say too, finally, just on a couple of specifics, because I'm not going to try to get into talking about all the issues in the negotiation. But let's talk about dairy, and let me talk about Buy America, just to pick two, and government procurement more broadly. Sorry, what?
The easy ones.
A couple of easy ones. So dairy, as somebody who's sort of watching what's going on in this area in Canada, I think actually that we could be getting to the point in the not too distant future where the pressures for reform in our dairy sector, in fact, you see it already with some of the changes in pricing, are becoming so big, the system has become so sclerotic, it just doesn't work. That, there's going to be domestic pressures as well as international pressures to make some changes. But it's the sort of thing you can't do quickly overnight because you need to work it out and plan it properly, and there'd have to be transition and so on. And let me clarify, I am not speaking for the government. But when you look, one of the things we'd be interested in here, though, I'm sure, if we get to that stage, is we want an even playing field and reciprocity. It's got to be fair. And if you look at U.S. dairy policy, it's not exactly an open market scheme either. In fact, you could go through. So are we talking here about a reform of Canadian dairy policy or a reform of American dairy policy, North American dairy policy? Where does this, what would be on the table in this negotiation? If the United States were prepared to say, okay, we'll have a fundamental look at how our dairy policy is structured as well and put that on the table, then, maybe we could have a different kind of discussion. I'm not sure that that's in prospect. Now, on Buy America, now it's very interesting. Let me just a couple of things. One is I noticed in looking at the draft letter that it talks about both Buy America in the United States, and it talks about trying to get better access to foreign procurement markets in the Nafta partners. So, we've been open for some time to the idea of enlarging our government procurement agreement within NAFTA with the United States. We're ready to do that, I think. And we've done it with the European Union. So, later this year, we will be giving, for the first time, major preferences at provincial level to European suppliers for surface transportation systems, electrical generating facilities, and so on. And I think it's going to be interesting, the first time that, some big European company wins a $600 million contract for one of these things in Canada, and their American competitor finds out that they weren't allowed to compete. So one of the big objectives we have had traditionally in trade negotiations, and I think we'd have it again now, is we want to get better controls on Buy America in the United States. And we're prepared to pay for that. So but from some of what I listened to, it doesn't sound like that's necessarily Mr. Trump's idea of how we'll do things. But maybe I'm wrong. I'll stop there because I thought I'd better, the amount of time we have is rather limited. We can't get into everything, but I thought I'd give a flavor of the big picture, a sense of perception of Canadians, and then look at some of the problems with trying to think about how you negotiate on a couple of issues that, as Alan said, are couple of the more difficult ones.
Alan, can I ask? Yeah, bring your microphone down. Perfect.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. The fact is that history tends to, I don't know if it repeats itself, it's said to rhyme. I started out in the U.S. Treasury, and what we were worried about is our trade deficit, in a sense. It was really, we had a surplus, but we were defending the whole world. We had given a lot of foreign aid, still giving a lot of foreign aid, and our surplus was not large enough to cover our obligations. So, and the French, always helpful, were flying plane loads of gold out of Fort Knox every night, which was a matter of concern because our reserves of gold backing the U.S. dollar at the time, which was fixed, the exchange rate was fixed, $35 an ounce, that we were going to be in real trouble. So along came an import surcharge, 10% against all imports, which I drafted at the time at Treasury, always a free trader at Treasury. And we put into effect a tax provision. The Domestic International Sales Corporation helped us on exports. We wouldn't tax them as heavily. I went over to Geneva a year before it was enacted to explain to the then GATT, the predecessor of the WTO, why it was legitimate, and sold no one. We put it into effect, and we were condemned by the GATT and removed it. Bob Lighthizer, who's the USTR designate, during his time in office at USTR, defended the next trade element of tax policy, the FISC, the Foreign International Sales Corporation, went over to Geneva and, of course, lost. And we're back to that again, where we're trying to figure things out. Well, we put on the import surcharge, and then we said, foreign markets are unfairly closed. There's a lack of reciprocity. So we had 3 delegations to negotiate, one with Japan, one with Europe, and one with Canada. I was on the Canada team. And for some reason, nobody wanted to give us unilateral concessions. We didn't understand it. It was appalling, but we just got no place. So there was a decision to have a multilateral round of trade negotiations called the Tokyo Round. And that did work. I was invited to be on this panel according to the esteemed Mr. Cunningham, and I won't use the term he used, but because I was somewhat bipolar in trade. I first came to Cleveland representing Republic Steel. Later, I represented LTV Steel, along with Lighthizer, in a group of 6 major steel companies that we represented against dumping and subsidization of and otherwise injurious imports. And for a little while, Wilbur Ross's company, because he wasn't in the steel business all that long, but I worked with him on that. But I chair the National Foreign Trade Council, which is the oldest free trade organization in the United States. And it doesn't go back quite as far as to the first free trade agreement between the U.S. and Canada. President Taft, native son here, wanted to have open trade, wanted to reduce tariffs. Congress wouldn't give him that. The conservative Republicans were against that at the time. And they said, but we'll let you have free trade with Canada. So the U.S. and Canada negotiated a free trade agreement under Taft and Laurier. And Laurier went home, and the government fell. Canada just couldn't live up to its obligations under that agreement. It was politically unpopular.
Very unfair.
Very, very unfair. We labor under an interesting disadvantage in that you have to get up early in the morning and read what's happened overnight from the White House to describe what's going on in trade policy. So Terry was telling about today's executive orders that are coming out in this area. What I want to do, go one step back for a moment, in Canadian waters anyway. Our current trade policy, you can date it back to when Cordell Hull was around Roosevelt, but you could also date it back to Placentia Bay in August of 1942 when Churchill and Roosevelt got together.
41.
42.
41.
41, August of 41.
Before Pearl Harbor.
I wasn't there.
Larry was.
41, you're right. Okay. That's
We'll go on, but somebody Google it quickly.
No, 41. Okay. The Atlantic Charter had two provisions in it that dealt with economics. And what basically said is all countries should have the ability to trade openly with each other. And it's sort of the vision of maybe a little bit more Roosevelt than Churchill in some ways. Churchill was always a free trader, but he did like, I think, imperial preferences. But the idea of multilateralism may have been born there and came into fruition with the GATT, which is relevant to where we are today. Terry has outlined the number of things that this administration has said about trade: economic nationalism, national sovereignty, buy American, hire American. All prior trade agreements are terrible. NAFTA is the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, but certainly ever signed in this country. That's Donald Trump in September. Stephen Mnuchin at coming back from the G20 summit of finance ministers said, so long as we can renegotiate trade deals that are good for us, we won't be protectionist, otherwise we will. So that's sort of this hands across the sea kind of attitude. Bilateral agreements are the way to go. As Terry has said, bilateral trade deficits, balances are the measure of success or failure. On the subject of the WTO, Terry may have noted a number of positive statements with respect to the WTO, and maybe John did, but I haven't found them. Public sentiment in the United States, which this administration says, first of all, whoever wins gets to determine what their mandate is. You can win by a very small margin if you're George W. Bush or if you're Donald Trump, and you have a mandate because you say you have a mandate. It turns out that 72% in 2017, Gallup survey says, exports are more of an opportunity than imports are a threat. And 73% of the 18 to 29 age group say that NAFTA has been good for the United States. The fellow who does this representing Pew Research says, Bruce Stokes says, all that has to happen is for this generation to die off, and we'll have potentially a free trade, outlook in the United States. Young people were a major part of the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, but they're free traders. Sort of interesting. So where do we go from here? March 1, the President's trade agenda for 2017, trade policy agenda came out. And it, while the tone is about economic sovereignty and economic nationalism, in fact, the reality of the bullet points of what they want to do are really, in a traditional sense, and centrist policy. Terry mentioned that as did John, that the Constitution is still in force in large parts. That commerce power is still in the Congress, and the administration has discovered the existence of the Congress, including on health care. The statutes are still in place. We do have the rule of law, and therefore a notice is going up to the Hill, which we see in draft because everything is leaked, that gives the negotiating objectives as they want to be spelled out. There was no change in the Congress of the United States to speak of. Orrin Hatch is still chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and Ron Wyden is still the ranking Democrat. If you look at the hearing, confirmation hearing for the U.S. Trade Representative, which was a love-in of sorts. Bob Lighthizer had been staff director 30 years ago or so of the committee, supported by Republicans and Democrats alike. Another sort of feature of the landscape is that the bureaucracy is still there. And in fact, it's all that's there, because in most departments of the U.S. government, there is just a secretary, top of the department, and maybe a political appointee of sorts, but not confirmed by the Senate. So there's a lot that is going to be pretty standard. Now, John described the promiscuity of the Canadian government with respect to free trade agreements. The question is, we want bilaterals now. It's just bilaterals. We don't know whether Nafta is a bilateral or whether it's a trilateral, and that will be yet to be discovered. But NAFTA is the first up. Where else do we turn? We'll date, sort of speed dating, with UK. They can't do anything with respect to, they're still members of the European Union, not in good standing. So we'll have some discussions with them. The Japanese really would prefer that we don't come across the Pacific and talk to them, because they're afraid that we'll say, well, a little more rice, a little more beef, a little this and that. And they liked TPP, as did I. Spent a lot of time on it. And then the list gets pretty thin in terms of who you have a deal with. There were talks with Vietnam that were not for a free trade agreement at this point, but sort of a why don't you live up to TPP and we'll see what we can do later kind of discussion. So then we come to NAFTA and what should be in it. And I had a whole series of things I would have said about what I thought would be in it, but then along came, because you'd have to wake up in the morning, and 2 days ago, we didn't know what would be in it in terms of the U.S. objectives, but now, to a substantial degree, we do. And it's an interesting letter. It's an 8-page letter available online. And the first paragraph is sort of interesting because the acting U.S. Trade Representative, Stephen Vaughn, notes that he has the authority delegated by him to notify the Congress under the Trade Act that passed, the Trade Promotion Authority, to give this notice. And so it's not a letter from Wilbur Ross, who was the Secretary of Commerce, who was designated to lead this thing. It's from the USTR, and the Finance Committee is quite intent upon USTR leading. And it has in it, I found, interesting things compared with the rhetoric, making it an objective, making it more profitable to manufacture within the trading bloc. That's North American integration. That's sort of an interesting thing to say, given the fact that it was, that's not exactly America first in language. Then it talks about a trade deficit with Canada and Mexico lumped in together, which is interesting because Canada, I think, would like to think of itself as having a deficit with us rather than, or at least imbalance, but take out the oil and raw materials, that the U.S. has a surplus. It recognizes global value chains. That's sort of interesting because actually that's not where this administration has, I think, where its head has been in terms it would like to roll back. Mr. Trump saying, don't have your plant in Mexico, to Carrier and to several others. That's very interesting. Seek to level the playing field on tax treatment. Now, that could be about Mexico's VAT. It could be about the U.S. border adjustability, sort of insulating the United States in a NAFTA agreement that we can put on a border adjustable measure in our tax system. Then you get to some other things like rules of origin are to support production and jobs in the United States, not the bloc. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but we slip back into America first. There's anti-dumping and countervail enforcement. I assume Terry wrote that. But it's sensible stuff. Protection of intellectual property. Cross-border data flows are to be open, fixing something that was wrong in TPP in terms of financial services. Now, when you get to government procurement, a defensive trench is dug in that it says that seek to establish rules that require government procurement to be conducted in a manner that is consistent with U.S. law and the administration's policy on domestic procurement preferences. That would seem to say, Canada, don't bother. We're going to keep our Buy America. There are elements of TPP that come in, anti-corruption, competition policy, state-owned enterprises. There's a safeguard mechanisms, not too exciting. It's a snapback to existing law. And there are things on labor and the environment that actually NGOs should like. And get rid of Chapter 19, which is the appellate process instead of U.S. courts for anti-dumping, countervail. And one of the interesting things is Lindsey Graham, who's still around, was one of 7 senators who wrote an amicus brief that said Chapter 19 is unconstitutional. So that's bound to come back. The right to regulate is in here, which is another NGO sort of thing. The protection of health, safety, environment, essential security, and consumer interests will be safeguarded. It's not revolutionary. It's very interesting. What isn't here? When Lighthizer was before, the USTR designate was before the Senate Finance Committee, they actually didn't talk about these things. What they talked about was dairy. 7 senators said Canadian dairy. By the way, all the complaints, I think, were all Mexico, not Canada. I mean, Canada, not Mexico.
Yes, this is the trouble, the difference between the grand rhetoric and the nitty-gritty that trade negotiations are actually about.
Right, so open dairy, and by the way, I don't think that Canada really would like a totally open market. Trudeau seems to have some base in Quebec and Ontario, and he would probably like to remain Prime Minister for a bit. They wouldn't fit with a totally open. We wouldn't have a totally open market, and Canada certainly wouldn't. So I don't think we're headed there. And they said, Senator Hatch, the chairman, said, and by the way, there's a patent utility doctrine in Canada that really has to go. Canada would perhaps find that difficult. It's on pharmaceuticals very largely. This has been practiced. Well, there are a series of things that were mentioned. Lighthizer can't come back, the USTR can't come back from a negotiation and say, by the way, we did none of the things that you asked. We didn't touch a single one of them. We modernized the agreement, but we didn't get into this. So lastly, sort of question of timing, which John has touched upon. Before this letter came out, there was the illusion that there were 2 choices. One is what we shall call technically a quickie, that just modernize it, get a bunch of stuff out of TPP, throw it in, 4 months we're done. Mexico very much wants this. It's the position of Mexico. Canada would really like that. But along comes this 8-page letter, which doesn't look like a quickie, and doesn't include the things that we're actually going to ask for, or that Canada's going to ask for. Canada would like Buy America to be waived pretty much with respect to Canada. We're supposed to have a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. They'd really, really, really like to participate fully in that infrastructure build-out. Canada would like freer movement of people across the border for services. The Congress seems to think that they have the lead role on immigration. which they don't exercise, but they like to hold on to it. So the things that Canada wants, we're very unlikely to find easy. The things that we want, Canada will find it very difficult to do. And then you get, just really lastly, what do we do with the WTO? Unmentioned. Who's going to lead? We have Xi Jinping coming out as the Davos man. The track record has not been grand with respect to China leading. I think for a variety of reasons. They have their own domestic problems. Going to Geneva and China saying, we want totally open trade, actually probably will not sell very well with 163 other members. So they're not really able to lead. Does Canada, Australia, some ASEAN, Lee Kuan Yew of this generation, if there is one, who gets up there and says, the U.S. is sitting back, and who's going to go for the multilateral trading system?
Angela.
Yes, well, she has some issues too. And does Mr. Trump follow Angela Merkel? Not very willingly. And the EU actually they have some internal issues of their own right now. So things don't look all that good for the ministerial in December. They never do, but I think it's a little bit worse off right now. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was a very good panel so far, but one of the great things about the Canada-US Law Institute is that we have a very learned and sharp audience with some outstanding up-and-comers among the students. So we'll take what was a great start and make it great again by getting all of you involved in the conversation. So I'm going to turn to people for questions, and I'll keep looking for you, so just flag it. I see Larry Herman is quick off the mark.
First of all, I want to thank the panel. I thought that was absolutely fantastic at a very high level. And I might say that it's the sort of thing that Cussley does very well, and we're all grateful for the thoughtfulness of each of you. When we look at the 8-page letter, whether it's tweaked or not in final form, I think it's probably something we can take as setting out the U.S. negotiating agenda. I have a couple of questions. First of all, everything is on the table when it comes to NAFTA renegotiation. I think that's quite clear. You can parse this any way you want, but basically it's saying everything is on the table. So my questions are one a narrow one and one a broader one. The first question is, wouldn't it be in Canada's interest to put something like this out from the Canadian perspective? I think that there's a loss of leverage if you just wait for the other guy to come back with specifics. So the question is, from a negotiating dynamics, shouldn't Canada say what Canada wants? And by the way, going back to the FTA, Canada paid for that binational panel system, Chapter 19. We paid for it, by and large, by giving you guys free trade in energy products. So maybe Canada should say something about what it is prepared to put on the table. But my broader question is this for each of you. This is an aggressive negotiating agenda. We've seen statements from the President during the campaign and in his inaugural address. And so my question is this: how much tension can the system take in terms of Canada-US relations? What do you think this is going to lead to in the process? Before the system, if I can put it that way, breaks down in broad political and diplomatic terms.
Would like to jump in on that.
Well, All right, I'll start, because part of it's about a Canadian list. And I think it would be interesting, too, to hear the other panelists here about what would they think the effect of a Canadian list would be in the United States, because I think that's one of the considerations that the Canadian government should have in mind when they're thinking of whether to prepare such a list. The other problem is the one that is the difference, in my experience, between sort of how Americans go about making policy for a trade negotiation, how Canadians do. And Americans, to my, are much more forthright about figuring out how they're going to get those damn foreigners. And so, they fashion proposals to get the foreigners that don't really think in the first instance about, oh, you mean we're going to have to agree to that too? And so I've seen a number of times where Americans, doesn't bother really them at all to sort of get partway through a negotiation and say, oh, by the way, we're withdrawing that proposal, or we're amending it to read as follows. With Canadians, the first thing Canadian ministers want to know when, officials come forward with a proposal for a negotiating mandate is, well, we're going to ask for that. What are they going to ask in return? So it's, or do we really want to suggest that we're actually willing to get into that discussion, like about dairy, for instance? Would we put on a list that that we want, what we'd like to see in terms of reform of the U.S. dairy sector, or at least that would be part of what we'd want the negotiation to be about? Because that would really make it clear that we were prepared to negotiate in that space. Now, I would say, I think that the political cost of doing something on dairy is greatly overestimated in a lot of political circles in Canada. Martha Hall Finley was a member of Parliament and actually ran for the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada, did a very interesting study on what would be the political consequences of substantially reforming dairy policy. And her conclusion was there was only one constituency in the country in which that might be the determining factor in the election. So, I suspect, the Canadian government could look at how to reform dairy policy. Maybe they'd rather not have to get into that, but a lot of it might be in terms of how it was presented, but it certainly couldn't be reformed without reform on the American side of the border as well. How much tension can the system take? I don't. That's a very good question, and I don't think the Canadian government would like to answer that question. Maybe they'll have to think about that internally, because we're going to come up.
It's a question for the American side.
Sorry?
It's a question for the American side. In other words, our friends need it or not?
Well, I won't attempt to answer it any further.
Well, we used to be friends with Australia. So there's a little bit of unpredictability in the system. I'd say, there's going to be a line at the door when the Canadian government says, well, we're going to go negotiate, and they're going to have some public process, and there'll be folks, everyone will come in who has an axe to grind or trade interest, and they're going to come in. Today, and I don't have it yet, maybe Terry does, but the national trade estimates come out from USTR. That's going to be part of our negotiating list, the Canada chapter of it, which is every complaint that we have with respect to every other country is listed. The Mexicans are already in the public process, so I think that there will be something of a Canadian list. The free trade and energy for Chapter 19. I thought Canada wanted to export a few things through a Keystone pipeline. Otherwise, what was all that about? In terms of tension, besides unpredictability, there's a very, very strong constituency for Canada in the U.S. Congress. And I think in the, generally speaking, in the bureaucracy and in the American people as a whole, Canada is not considered a country with which we ought to have serious problems. So reality creeps in. I mean, one of the things that's going to shape the negotiation is reality. All of American business, with very few exceptions, if there are any, want to have good relations with Canada. You know, the Canadian Embassy has a screen in Washington on the wall that talks about the amount of trade that goes across one bridge, Windsor and Detroit, is equal to whatever, a couple of weeks of trade. In one day, it's the same as a month or two of trade with Japan. There's a strong constituency for maintaining that relationship, and I don't think a tweet is going to destroy that, and I certainly don't think this negotiation is. This is a very centrist document that came out, the 8 pages. It's not an attack on Canada. It's not even an attack on Mexico. You know, I think that there will be a traditional negotiation, and we'll come out of it still with some shreds of our friendship intact across the border.
Let me just add a couple of thoughts. I agree that while the list may be a starting point, I think it in fact will be fairly significantly modified, both for the reasons that Alan reviewed, that none of the issues or few of the issues that were actually raised by the Senate Finance Committee and the confirmation hearing for Bob Lighthizer are picked up. And you already had significant opposition come out from the Democrats for what hasn't been included in the list. So I think that you will see a compilation of other things to go through. At the end of the day, at the moment, U.S. agriculture is in a 4-year slump because U.S. agriculture is, some would say, overrepresented, but certainly prominently represented in the Senate Finance Committee. There is keen interest in seeing that markets are further open for agriculture, and that will be a key break, I think, in terms of how aggressive the U.S. is in terms of pushing past the tension points. Simply because the U.S. does not want to find itself in a situation where significant market access is lost because people start to pull out of agreements. And I would say one of the issues that isn't on the list that I would expect to be there by the time the list is finished is geographical indications and the wonderful deal that you all have cut with the Europeans.
Governor Blanchard.
Yeah, this has really been helpful. Terry, you mentioned about the popular attitude on trade. I think it's important for our audience to recall that even in 2008, Hillary called for renegotiating NAFTA in a debate with Barack Obama in Ohio, and he finally consented to that as well. All the candidates came out against TPP. I did notice in the rallies in Michigan that Bernie Sanders carried Michigan as well. The rallies were all young, mostly young people, all having driven to the rallies cars imported from Japan. So I don't think the young people were not exactly there because of trade. They were there because he was giving the finger to the system, to the big banks, to Wall Street, to whatever, the corrupt politicians that he claimed had ruined our country. What I wanted to mention, though, was I think the Buy America provisions are really going to be much more significant. There was a Buy America provision in the stimulus bill, and it got there. The big lobbyist for it was Leo Gerard, a Canadian steel. He didn't think it would. I guess he didn't think it was going to apply to Canadian steel. Well, it turned out it did, even though we had a procurement agreement. The procurement agreement didn't include subnational entities because at the time, Canada didn't want to ask its provinces to assent to the agreement. So I don't know how when I talked to Sandra Levin, for example, he didn't think it was going to apply to Canada. Well, it did. And I think it got finessed. But I think that's a big one. And I don't know whether there's going to be a way to exempt Canada from Buy America or not. Ambassador Heyman mentioned that Governor Cuomo's already got a Buy New York, and that's triggered friction with the Premier of Ontario. So these are all things swimming around, but I think it's going to be a huge issue, maybe bigger than dairy and some of the others. I really do. My question, though, that was my speech. Now my question is, you guys have enormous experience at this. Who are the people that you feel have the best kind of judgment and knowledge in Congress or in the administration? I mean, I understand Lighthizer is a very talented guy, will do a good mainstream job, is what I hear. But who are the people that, Alan over the years, or Terry, at least in the U.S., that you trust to handle these things wisely and with some depth in terms of politics?
Well, Ways and Means and Finance leadership are really pretty solid, and there'll be the occasional issue, like with Ron Wyden, he might care a little bit about lumber. But, generally speaking, there's a center of gravity in the two committees that is, I think, very helpful. Paul Ryan's not at odds with where Kevin Brady is. An issue will come up over the border adjustability if that comes through the House. And that's going to be a big issue for Canada, super big issue, I would think. Maybe more than government procurement, but at least a rival.
Certainly more than government procurement.
Yeah.
Actually.
But as we know from
I was going to say it might be bigger than NAFTA. Probably is.
It's going to be interesting. My proposal for that is, if the U.S. did it, that there be if we do adopt border adjustability, what we have is an international conference of finance ministers and trade ministers with tax folks and with economic experts, and work through how our various tax structures affect each other. But putting that aside, government procurement, I think you're quite right, is going to be a major issue. What does Canada want to ask of the United States? That's, I would think, going to be number one. First of all, you have to have been in the steel business to be in this administration. Wilbur Ross was, Lighthizer was.
Or in the military.
The two deputies. Well, there's another thing. The number one, the number one competitor in all of this is China, which has gone somewhat silent. We'll see what comes out of the Xi Jinping meeting, if anything. Trump has already said it's going to be a very difficult meeting. And we'll see how that's managed. I would think the generals care a lot about whether nuclear missiles come in our direction. And it's difficult to have a very contentious trade relationship and solve really the major problems we have. And by the way, I do wish Chrystia Freeland luck with an agreement with China. There's nothing like a free trade agreement with China to do wonders for your economy, especially for having a lot of natural resources dug out of the ground by Chinese and shipped back home.
Are you lecturing us?
Yes.
Let me just add to Alan's comment. I think that there is a tension between the Congress and the administration in terms of trade that has largely been kept below the surface at this point. For exactly the reasons that Alan went through, you have, I think, a very traditional view of trade policy in both of the core committees, which will drive most of the process. And there has been pushback on a range of issues that the administration at least talked about, or the president talked about during the campaign, in terms of unilateral tariffs and those sorts of things. That being said, because we're still at the stage where the Congress is trying to work with the administration, I do think that they will perhaps accept some of the issues that are of importance to the administration in the trade policy modification arena than they would have. And of course, it has been the Congress and not the administration that has teed up border adjustability, which is really an issue, as Alan reviewed in his opening statement. It's been out there for the U.S. for 50 years, the distinction in treatment between direct and indirect taxes that we foolishly accepted back in the 50s as part of the GATT. And there was a very interesting piece in the New York Times on March 7th that was that Keith Archer put out that kind of took a look.
Somebody got to him. Was my conclusion when I read that.
All you have to do is look at the two charts he has. The first chart takes a look at the average tariffs, and the second chart takes a look at the combination of tariffs and indirect taxes that countries have. The problem that the U.S. identified back in the 60s when we tried to start working with our trading partners to get the issue resolved is in bold relief in terms of those two charts. So we either can find a multilateral approach that deals with some of the discrimination or distortions because we've been unwilling or unable to adopt a value-added tax system ourselves, all right? Or we find, or we will end up with these kind of half steps, like the border adjustability that's out there, which tries to do much of that. But the only reason it's in the Republican bill is that it pays for a significant part of the tax relief, so that you're not driving even larger budget deficits for the United States.
Stephen Petrus.
Thanks again to the panel. Outstanding. This question, I think I'll direct it first to Terry, and then the rest of the panelists can chime in. But it seems that Trump's approach is, or at least to get elected, was focused on jobs, creating jobs, big jobs. And he blamed trade agreements. And then the reality is, like Governor Blanchard mentioned, that that's one thing maybe, but it's not the biggest. You know, there's technology, there's automation, there's all these other pressures on jobs. In the analysis that's being done, is the Trump administration, maybe behind closed doors, looking at that issue, looking at, what is technology going to do to employment as we go forward, and what are the ways to deal with that?
Well, I guess my own view is that we have so many gaps still existing in the personnel that I'm sure it is an issue that is of concern within the administration, but I don't know that it is receiving a high priority at this point in time. I think most of the people who have complained about trade and job loss, the argument that technology is the main driver of reduction of jobs has never been an issue that has been contested by folks who are concerned. But we are the only nation on the face of the earth that runs a $750 billion a year trade deficit in goods, okay? The only nation. And it is not due to development because Germany runs a large trade surplus. Japan fluctuates between surplus and small deficit. And so the fact that neither party has been willing to try to figure out why it is we have shifted into such a large trade deficit structure over the last 40 years is really, in my view, what drives the concern. The fact that the administration puts out a figure, here's how many jobs we get from $1 billion of exports, but you can never find a figure that says, here's how many jobs we lose from $1 billion of imports, only adds to the concern that the people inside the Beltway care about their policy and don't care about what the effect is on lives of people out in the business community, in the smokestack industries or high-tech industries or agriculture, who are not seeing the benefits. So Sure, technology is an issue, and there's some big automation issues that are out there that will affect a lot of people going forward. But those are not, the steel industry doesn't complain because they went from having tens of thousands of people at plants to a few hundred or 1,000 people at a plant. That was all part of the modernization that they have done. They are concerned when we run a large trade deficit in steel, or the steel that comes in seriously undermines the prices of domestic steel and puts the companies on the ropes and results in large layoffs. And those are the issues that I think the Trump administration cares about, because those are the issues that they heard in the town meetings when they were in Ohio or Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or North Carolina, where people were saying, nobody listens to us. And the real reason, in my view, that NAFTA is viewed so negatively by so many working people in America doesn't have much to do with the trade deficit. It has everything to do with the fact that virtually every company in the country uses the ability to move jobs to Mexico or China as a justification for not increasing wages or having very marginal increases of wages. I've been in businesses, I've seen negotiations, and I can tell you it is a constant beat over the head. If you seek a pay increase that would keep you even with inflation or ahead of inflation, we're going to move these jobs, whether it be to Mexico, and Mexico is usually used because it's a neighboring country and it's obvious, or China, which is another example. That is the kind of the great elephant in the room that never gets talked about in terms of why there is so much angst about NAFTA.
I could go ahead.
Well, you can go first. Then I really will be able to attack both of you.
Okay. The trade policy agenda, the March 1 trade policy agenda of the President of the United States for 2017 ends on the following. It says we're going to have domestic measures in terms of lower taxes, less regulation, and spending on infrastructure. And then it says, and we'll negotiate better trade agreements. It's a trade document that talks about macroeconomic or broader issues. Now, how does that play through in the budget? Not so much, because there's nothing on worker training except cuts. There's basic R&D is cut, which I think is a tremendous error, really terrible. What hasn't come up, by the way, in all of this is a little more on steel. By the way, be in this administration, either you worked for Goldman Sachs or you litigated steel. It's binary. The only two choices that if you're going to be involved in trade. So I think with China, you probably say if there maybe voluntary export restraints come back because capacity reduction isn't going to do it. Whether Xi Jinping can sacrifice jobs to do that is a question. And what we didn't touch upon, I don't think, is currency. It's not in the letter.
Raised by the Democrats.
And it's been raised as something missing. My own view is that the fact that currency manipulation, which is called for, that you should not defeat trade concessions through manipulation of currency, is in the GATT. It's in the IMF Articles of Agreement, and that will come back, I think. That'll be an added element. But it's not that the administration has totally ignored the subject, that there are other things going on. But they're not headed, I think, in the right direction with respect to, other than the tax side of things, which in terms of lowering the corporate rate and potentially some less regulation, they're not tending to those issues in the same way. But it's not forgotten that those elements are out there. Sean?
Very good comments, both of you. I think one of the problems here is that although manufacturing output in the United States is going up, and is, I think, larger now than it ever has been, employment in manufacturing has obviously been going down. And I think to some extent we're witnessing, and this is true probably in all three NAFTA countries, we're witnessing something that was what happened in the in a century ago in terms of agriculture. I mean, in 1800, what percent of the American population was employed in agriculture? And now, whatever it was then, I'm sure it was probably around 80% of people who were employed. Now it's down under 2%, I believe. And yet agricultural production is much higher. So we have so I come back to this because this is really about technology and what's happening in technology. And I think that probably in Canada, but certainly in the United States, I think the political leadership has been somewhat dishonest in not coming out with the public and saying the reason, these people are sitting at home, the lives behind the malaise described in Hillbilly Elegy is caused by the major disruptor being technological change and innovation. But it's pretty hard to say, well, what do you if you're a political leader and you acknowledge this is the problem, so what do you do about it? So we're going to ban the internet, smash everybody's computer, and tell them it's illegal to have a smartphone. This is how we could fix this, because then there'd be a lot more people employed. No, it's much easier to blame foreigners and foreign goods, foreign investment, foreign workers, and come at it that way. And there's been almost no political constituency in the United States for people who would stand up in an election campaign and say, well, actually, that's not the way it is. It's the tendency has been to get on the bandwagon, whether you're Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, on the hustings and blame foreigners and say that the trade agreement is bad and I'll fix it when I'm elected. And I think that we now the ultimate bankruptcy of that is now evident as a policy approach, and I think another problem in this in terms of trade-related adjustment assistance, the whole concept of that kind of suggests to the common person that it's trade that's causing the dislocation that requires adjustment assistance. I mean, in Canada, our policies aren't perfect, but we've tried to design policies that deal with the problem of dislocation of the workforce rather than ascribing it to a particular cause, and then looking at what do you do to address that. So I think you've touched on something that's very important and that has become central in the trade debate, but ought not to really be part of the trade debate.
Question over here. We get the.
Bruce Lowe from Taft. One element that perhaps has been completely overlooked in this equation is something that I was reminded of when I was listening to a national public radio program a few weeks ago. And they were interviewing a chap from Rexnord, which is a big Indianapolis-based outfit. And they were interviewing a chap who'd just been laid off after about 25 or 30 years on an assembly line manufacturing type floor job. And he was being laid off because his job had been was going to be moved to Mexico, where they were building a new plant. He said, well, it's not my preference, but I'm sort of near the end of my working career. And, at least I've got something put away, so I'm not terribly bad shape. And most important of all, both of my two kids have just gotten through college. That reminded me the fact that, we've been sending for the past several generations, we've been sending most of our children, whenever we could, to college in the U.S. to do things, to learn, to get a degree, to supposedly do something other than working on an assembly line or in a manufacturing job at the lower level. The population, therefore, the working population, it seems to me, in succeeding generations has significantly changed, and it's something that it seems to me that very often is overlooked by politicians. Hopefully, politicians on both sides of the border in increasing numbers in the next few years will more and more recognize this and deal not with lambasting free trade and trade deals, but find ways to find full employment for the changed labor force. Could you comment on that, Mr. Please.
Gentlemen, what about that?
Yeah, I would agree that that's very much the case. And a lot of folks in academia are working on the issue of worker training for the needs that are coming forward. Just one element that came out earlier, trade adjustment assistance being the wrong answer. Lots of folks understood that it shouldn't just be trade adjustment assistance. It was a matter of cost. George Shultz said we should have unemployment insurance and a number of other programs, and we couldn't afford it, we thought, so we didn't do it, and we still don't do it. I think that the community colleges, for example, and National Foreign Trade Council has now started a new project with respect to worker training. A lot of companies are very good at working with local institutions to come up with worker training that suits their needs, so that's market driven. If you look at upstate New York, which was pretty much had a little bit of wine of dubious quality, I shouldn't say, but I represented Kodak for a while. They went away, and that was technology. A little bit of trade too, to be sure. There was dumping of film. It helped them go under, but it was technology. But outside of Albany in Malta, a town probably no one had heard of other than those who lived there, the Development Authority had a not shovel-ready, but permit-ready and infrastructure-ready location for a semiconductor fabrication facility. They put in some money. A sovereign wealth fund from Abu Dhabi put in a lot of money, and it was because there are universities there and colleges that formed a consortium to train workers that are needed for that sort of activity. If you look around the world I work with the semiconductor industry, where plants are located, they are located where there is the infrastructure that's needed for semiconductor production. If you look around the world where an R&D is taking place, it's where there's a pool of engineering talent, and it turns out, and rule of law. So it's not so much in China, but it's a lot in Eastern Europe, in Israel, in the United States, where IP will be protected, and where there's a pool of workers engineers that can design these chips. I think business is getting pretty smart about locating where there's human talent, and that's a lot of the future of our country lies there. So I think your points are well taken.
No, you jump in, Terry.
I guess my kind of macro point would be I agree that there's been obviously a tremendous change in terms of the type of work that is available. And the United States has done a very poor job over time of orchestrating so that people can take advantage of where the opportunities are. But to simply say that there are not issues because there's a smaller percentage of people that are going into manufacturing than there used to be is to ignore the disparity in income that has arisen and the stagnation of incomes that has been going on for over 40 years in the United States, and that is the genesis of the movement for the Trump administration.
John, do you want to say anything about where, is this the same in Canada? Are we
Well, I think so. I mean, I think this is a key point. The jobs that our grandchildren are going to be doing are going to be quite different from the jobs our grandparents were doing. And this change is going to continue, and it's going to accelerate. And so we need to be doing a better job of identifying where are these requirements. A university degree may be a fine thing, but it's not necessarily going to equip you for the marketplace of tomorrow. So, we need to have a more hands-on approach to how we approach these issues. Plus, I think the other problem is there needs to be some. I thought both answers were good, and I like your description of what business is actually doing, and then looking, at how businesses are locating near centers where they can have the intellectual expertise they need to do the things that are now important. But you don't get much recognition of that in the public space. I mean, this is in politics. This is why you've got this. Yeah, you've got this populist backlash. Partly, I mean, of course, there's a problem there, and too many politicians weren't prepared to say, "I acknowledge your hurt." I mean, that's what Trump did. He formed that link with those people, and then sold them on the rest of the message that I think wasn't really quite an accurate diagnosis of what the real problem was.
Speaking of acknowledging hurt, I've been very nice about the lawyers. College degrees are still worthwhile, says the professor to the students. Don't give up on that, John.
Depends which degree.
Could I add just one thing on employment possibilities?
By the way, this is going to be terrific for lawyers.
Yes, that's my point. That's exactly it. If you want to go into trade law, trade negotiations.
Can I be retrained?
It's going to be great. So that's a good career path.
Last word to Jim Blanchard.
This has been great. I wanted to mention about talent. All governors spend their time recruiting business. And I never had a problem. It might sound crazy, but we never had a problem recruiting businesses to Michigan. As long as we had the talent pool, the research universities, the community colleges, and a reasonable infrastructure, that was more important than actual costs. Our costs were about average of most states, but it was the talent, the training, the research. It's the brain power. And talent is where the economy and the quality of life is going to be. The only other thing I want to say, I want to back up, because what you said was so simple yet so profound, Terry, and you reminded me of something, which is regardless of what the facts are and how many jobs have been lost and how many have been gained, and we always overstate the benefits of trade deals. You know that. The politicians, and I used to be one, always overstate the benefits. But I think you're right when you said when there's negotiations going on, the elephant in the room is always the threat of moving jobs overseas. And I think every bargaining committee of every union has that facing them. And I think that really is, that probably leads more to the angst than anything. And I'm glad you reminded me of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking a terrific panel for their remarks today.
Okay, thank you everybody for your time and attention. We'll take a brief break, try to keep it to 10 minutes, and we come back with another great panel here soon. Thank you.
That was great. No, it was terrific.
I thought it was a good discussion.
Thank you for the correction. Yeah, 19